Helen Keller, Chapter 8. It's entitled, I Am Not Dumb Now. Teacher decided to take Helen north for the summer. Helen remembered that trip for the rest of her life. First, she and Teacher went to Perkins Institute in Boston, Massachusetts. They stayed there for a month. The teachers at Perkins all made a fuss over Helen. She wasn't sure why, but she liked it all the same. She played happily with the boys and girls at the Institute for hours each day. But best of all were the books. Perkins Institute was a school for the blind, so all of its books were in Braille, or raised print. Oh, the joy of it! Row after row of books, and every one she could read for herself. Helen already knew how important books were going to be in her life. They tell me so much that is interesting about things I cannot see, she said, and they are never tired or troubled like people. But Helen didn't spend all her time reading books. There were so many other interesting things to do. Teacher took her to a play. Helen couldn't see or hear what was going on, of course, but Teacher spelled everything into her hand. Helen rode on her first steamboat. The little ship was full of life and motion. The rumble of machinery under her feet made Helen think of thunder. One day Teacher took Helen to the nearby town of Plymouth, and Helen stood on Plymouth Rock, where almost 300 years ago, she was told, the first pilgrims had landed in America. After Perkins Institute closed for the summer, Teacher took Helen to visit a friend who lived by the sea. Helen played happily in the warm, soft sand. She loved to sit on a rock and feel wave after wave wash over her legs. Soon she was toasty brown, like Mia. Then the weather turned cool. It was fall and time to go home again. Helen could hardly wait to be with her mother and father again, so she had so many things to tell them about this first trip into the world. It was a time when I lived myself into all things, Helen later wrote. One day, soon after Helen and Teacher had returned to Tuscumbia, Teacher spelled, "Come and sit beside me. I have a new book to read you. It's called Little Lord Fauntleroy, and I think you will like it very much." So Helen snuggled down beside Teacher. She held out her hand, and Teacher began to read. Oh, what an exciting story! At first Teacher tried to stop and explain the hard words, but Helen only wanted her to go on, go on. Teacher spelled for a long time, but then she began to slow down. Finally she stopped. "Just a little bit more," Helen begged, but Teacher shook her head. "My fingers are tired," she spelled. "I have to rest them a while." And she put back her head and closed her eyes. Helen nodded. She knew that Teacher did not really mean that her fingers were tired. She knew that Teacher really meant her eyes were tired. For once, Teacher had been blind too, almost as blind as Helen. Teacher had had operations on her eyes, and now she could see a little. But her eyes were still very weak. Often she got terrible headaches, and most of the time she had to wear dark glasses to keep out the bright light of the sun. So Helen tried to be patient. She sat as still as she could and waited for what seemed a very long time. But oh, she wanted to know what happened next in the story. So finally her hand crept out. "Teacher?" she spelled softly. Teacher's hand curled around hers, but it didn't answer back. Helen sighed. Teacher was fast asleep. Suddenly Helen felt terribly, terribly alone. She reached out and brushed her hand across the book, still open in Teacher's lap. There were words on these pages, but not for her. Never for her. Oh, why did she have to be so different? And then, in that moment of bitterness, the beginning of an idea came to Helen's mind. She knew she would never be able to see. She knew she would never be able to hear. But there was one thing she might be able to do, like other people. As the days went by, Helen began to ask questions. How do blind girls know what to say with their mouths? Do deaf children ever learn how to speak? Finally, ideas came bursting out. "Teacher, I want to talk like other people. Teach me to talk with my mouth." At first, Teacher said no. She thought that this was an impossible dream. "Blind children can hear," she spelled gently. "Deaf boys and girls can see. Other people's lips move." But Helen was growing more and more unhappy talking with her hands. Most people couldn't understand this way of talking. Besides, Helen's mind had grown so much, Her thoughts came so fast one after another that her fingers could not keep up. Helen was 9 years old now. Often she spelled so fast people had to tell her, "Slow down. Your fingers are all tangled. You have to say it again." And still thoughts piled up in her brain. So Helen would not take no for an answer. She was sure they would finally find a way, somehow. Finally, teacher gave in. "But I'm not trained to teach you myself," she spelled. "We will have to find someone else who can." Finally, teacher took Helen back to Boston, Massachusetts. There at the Horace Mann School, Miss Sarah Fuller began to teach Helen how to speak with her mouth. Helen put her hand on Miss Fuller's face. She touched her lips and tongue. She felt the way Miss Fuller's throat vibrated when she made the simple word, "ah." Then it was Helen's turn. Her hands flew to her own face. She tried to put her lips and tongue in the same position. She tried to make her throat vibrate into the same sound, "ah." "Good, Helen," Miss Fuller spelled. Oh, Helen was proud. She had taken her first step forward. But it was only a baby step. Again and again, Helen learned how to make a sound, only to forget it. Then she had to start all over again. Practice, practice, practice. Helen practiced until her mouth and throat were swollen and sore. And still so many sounds slipped away. "Oh, this is too hard. I cannot do the impossible," she would cry to herself then. But she refused to give up, and little by little she got better, until one day Helen opened her mouth and said in a growly voice, "I am not dumb now. I'm not dumb now." 5 broken words. 2 were spoken in a whisper. 3 were spoken in a shout. She would have to practice all her life. She would never learn how to speak very clearly, but a miracle had happened all the same. Helen Keller had learned how to talk with her mouth. The end of that chapter.